Now, let me ask you, you arrived in the Senate in '64, and Dole came 4 years later.
68.
There's Nixon's in the White House. First president since Zachary Taylor to have both houses controlled by the opposition.
Right.
And Dole arrives as a newcomer and is quickly dubbed the sheriff of the Senate.
Yep.
Tell me about that. Because one sense is that he, more than most, illustrates at least the capacity for growth.
Yes.
Over time.
Yeah.
And but in order to demonstrate growth, you have to go back to the beginning. What was Bob Dole like when he arrived in the Senate?
Somebody said politicians either grow or they swell. And Bob grew, and I was there when he arrived, and he'd been in the House, and I think he brought a lot of that House idea of our team versus your team into the Senate chamber. And I remember a painful afternoon when he was on his feet, regaling his Senate colleagues for not voting as a unit on some political issue, and berating them in front of the press about who do they think they are, aren't they Republicans, and so on. Boy, I heard a lot of negative comments about that, and I think he spent some time living that down.
Of course, he was also chairman of the RNC.
Yes,
early on.
At the same time.
Yeah.
But I could see him change, and he got over that stuff, and I think partly because of experience with Nixon, probably he found those years of the RNC, in the end, very dispiriting, and he found the Senate a better place for his life and what he believed in than some of that other politics that used to be so important to him.
And of course, he also had the near-death experience of '74.
Yes.
When he came very close to losing that seat.
Yes. We used to do a lot with Bob Dole. Humphrey did. Humphrey and Dole were very close.
Were they close from the beginning? Or was
I think maybe it took Dole a couple of years before he got off this first approach, the House approach, I might call, and became what he really became, an excellent senator. But I think he began working with all of us on farm issues. We're all from the farm block. We all had farmers. We had rural issues. We had things we could work on together. Our voters expected us to work on it together. Each state has 2 senators, and each of us are important. And then Bob Dole did more than that. He helped shape the food stamp program, the school lunch and school breakfast programs, and he went beyond the traditional farm state senator, adding a conservative voice to the use of food to help some real social problems in America. And he really helped give it legitimacy and gave us the oomph to pass it.
And it's, of course, ironic that one person with whom he worked very closely on that was George McGovern.
Absolutely.
Who he had been beating up on as RNC chairman in '72.
Bob Dole and Humphrey used to go down to Miami, Florida. They had a friend, Dwayne Andrews, and sometimes they'd get down there around Christmas and they'd have a good time. Their families would be there. No, they were good friends, but you'd see them on the campaign trail, listen to their speeches, you wouldn't believe it.
But it was possible to compartmentalize.
Yeah, and that's what I remember about those days. I think it was Tip O'Neill said, politics ends at 6 o'clock. People would go off that floor. I remember one time I was at a hearing, Howard Baker came in, I got mad at him, and I said some sharp things to him, and he got mad at me, and we walked out of the room together. I said, Howard, I'm trying to think of what I was mad about. He said, I was having the same problem. In those days, you'd try to diminish those disputes and keep a personal connection. That was part of the joy of the Senate.
Well, it's as if, in a nutshell, you tried to narrow differences rather than exploit them.
Right. And there were such strengths to be found in finding that human connection. So many ways in which you could solve problems. You know, Tom Eagleton, God bless him, once talked about the Senate as this remarkable institution that kept the Union together as we moved to the West, as we had to have the Civil War, but as we started to get race behind us, as we started to deal with all the industrialization, all these different changes that had ruined so many other countries, somehow America kept it going. And the great instrument for compromise and reconciliation was always and continues to be the U.S. Senate. And I believe to do that, the senators themselves have to believe that compromise can be and must be an essential part of public service.
Were there people in particular on the other side of the aisle that you found yourself working with?
Oh, yeah. Well, I worked with Bob Dole on a lot of, on the agriculture stuff and on the food stamp things, the Hunger Commission.
Do you think that was an eye-opening experience for him? Because he had, you know, I often thought, people emphasize, understandably, his war experiences.
Yes,
all that.
yes.
I've often thought they tend to overlook the defining experience of growing up in the Dust Bowl in the Depression with no money.
Yeah.
And no prospects.
Right, and poor, he came from a small rural county. I'm sure he didn't have much money, and all of them went through the horrors of the great collapse of land prices and the 30s, the Depression and so on, hit farmers almost worse than anybody. I don't think any of them ever got over it.
I've often wondered, I think there's a little bit of the populist.
Oh, yes.
In Dole.
And that's what helped build him as a leader, I think. You asked me a moment ago about the food stamp and school lunches and so on. If you'd asked me in '68, would Bob Dole do something like that, I'd say I doubt it. But as he developed, he not only did it, he was a leader. And he knew what he was doing. There are a lot of right-wingers that resented what he was doing. But he was able to shape these issues in a way that really made a big difference for every school child.
I know he cherished the friendship with Humphrey.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that was something that really...
They had, you know, they were down there, I mentioned, in Florida together, but they would work together on all these. I think they were on the Agriculture Committee together for 25 years. When I was at Humphrey's funeral in the Rotunda, Bob Dole was one of the first people to come in the Rotunda. No, they were very close.
And I think they talked not long before
they did.
Senator Humphrey died.
Yeah, they were on the phone together. I think Bob came over to see him. Yeah.
Why do you think it's so difficult for senators to move directly from the Senate to the White House? And I wonder, I'll break that down, if there isn't a kind of, for example, in Dole's case, almost a different senatorial lingo. You know, you stay inside the Beltway, and you begin to develop this shorthand, and it doesn't translate outside the Beltway. Is that one factor?
Well, I got some theories about it. They're only theories. Senators, by and large, have not done well running for the presidency. There's something that the public is concerned about. I think part of it is that you take Bob Dole, who'd been around the Congress a long time. He knew these issues. He knew about appropriations in the budget. He knew about what was possible and what wasn't possible. He'd been around long enough to see many dreams turn into dust. And you get a certain kind of, say, mature view about how politics works. And I think that when you go out and run for president, it helps to be naive, you know, to really believe you could do all this stuff, and so it sparkles in your eyes, and then find out later how tough. Once you've been through it, time and again, as Bob Dole, it doesn't sparkle the same way.
And when you have a mordant sense of humor to begin with, I mean, it's sort of, you know.
It's not really dawn in America there.
No.
The other thing, of course, is I think that in the Senate, if you're there for a while, you vote on everything. you vote over and over again on everything. And so it's harder to run for president and say, this is where you stand in a fresh way when you've had 17 votes on that issue in the Senate. So a candidate's range of movement believable movement is reduced. And I think that the appeal for change is easier for an outsider than for someone. You know, the insider will argue experience, the outsider will say fresh start. And
we're seeing that.
And Americans usually go for the fresh start. Yeah. And the governor, and that's usually what it is, can argue that he's been an executive and the senator is only a windbag.
Is it exaggerated, the tendency of senators once they arrive in the Senate to look in the mirror and see potential presidents?
Well, Bob Dole's, not Bob Dole, the DNC chairman, Bob
Strauss?
Yeah, well, my friend Bob. Bob Strauss said he had a secret list of 10 senators who were not interested in running for president. So, no, it is a kind of infectious disease there. I think once a senator starts doing well, and people back home start feeling good about the person, that his friends are saying, say, you should be president. And this has happened somewhat autobiographical in this case.
Well, I was going to say, and when did you begin to think about that?
Well, I was in I think the 6th grade when I don't know, 72 or something like that.
Yeah. And of course, now you famously said, what was the line about not staying at the Holiday Inn?
Yeah, I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in Holiday Inns. And then when I ended up running for vice president with Carter, I got confronted with that right away, and I said, well, they've all been redone. So it's all right.
But I wonder, in a curious sort of way, I wonder if that didn't recommend you to Carter. I mean, let's face it, traditionally presidents pick a running mate and then look over his shoulder to see if he's got ambitions to, you know. And from the beginning, that never seemed to be an issue between you and President Carter.
No, and I think it says something about Carter. I think a lot of times vice presidents have trouble with their president because they're reminding them of mortality. There's a kind of a Shakespearean relationship there that can raise doubts. But I don't think Carter had any of those concerns at all. At least if he did, I never sensed them. And so it allowed us to work without that level of difficulty. And I think, I believe we had, not only did we break institutional grounds, no one had done what Carter did before, but I think we proved it could really work and help a president. And if should it occur, help educate a vice president to become a better president.
You and Bob Dole would find yourselves running against each other in 76. Yeah. How did you get to be on the Democratic ticket?
I think that Carter, who was the putative nominee and had, I think, the choice of almost whoever he wanted, looked at a range of candidates, went up to Congress and checked all of us out, and I think that I fit what he needed. I could help him in the North, where he was having some troubles, and in the Midwest. I had a lot of friends that I think would be stronger for the ticket. There are others who could have done the same thing, but I think that I could do it. And I think he liked the sorts of things I was doing in the Senate and the things that I was interested, and in a strange, wonderful way, to me, I was a Northern civil rights advocate. I got that from Humphrey, I got it from my father. I thought that's what my faith told me to be for, and I was involved in almost every civil rights fight over all those years. And suddenly, for the first time in 20 years, you have a Southern candidate for president with a strong civil rights record. And I was really thrilled by what that could mean in terms of putting that issue that has so dogged our country behind us finally. And I think that was a big attraction in both directions.
And people forget, it's amazing how the electoral calendar reverses itself. 30 years ago, of course, you swept the South, and Ford took Michigan, New Jersey, Connecticut, California.
Right.
It's just extraordinary.
And we had a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
And we finally won at 3 in the morning with Mississippi in 1976.
Now, I've always wanted to ask you, because needless to say, being around him, it's a sensitive subject. When you were standing there in the middle of that debate, and you heard him talk about Democrat wars, did you think to yourself, oh, thank you, God, for delivering me this?
Something like that. Well, you know, we had a meeting, and I'm sure he had a meeting, trying to anticipate what would come up in the debate. And it just at the beginning, this was kind of a trial run, so we're ready. And the last thing that was raised, just as we were closing the meeting, somebody said, I'll bet that Bob Dole will say that the Democrat Party caused World War II. I said, you're crazy. He said, no. He said, he says that on the campaign trail. I'll bet you'll hear it again. And he did it. And you know, it was devastating. The public just did not want that. And it was just a bad day for Bob Dole. It really wasn't what he meant at all, but it came out, and I think it really was decisive.
Did you know instantly?
Yeah, I knew where he was going. You know, politicians are not very complex. We're all given these speeches, we all got our best lines, and I was aware of this one. I just didn't think he'd use it.
Now, to go back, so did you have a actual kind of a rehearsal beforehand? I mean, did someone play Dole?
But no, we didn't. We weren't that sophisticated in those days. We just sat down with 8 or 10 people who had studied the issues, and we discussed what the issues would be and what Dole has been saying, what he might say, what I would say, and that sort of thing. We didn't have this mock debate stuff that is now standard.
And what did your running mate? Did he talk to you that night after the debate?
He was very pleased. He knew, and the election was very close, campaign was very close, and I think we opened up a lead of 2 or 3 points the next day. And you know, that it was that, and the remarkable thing that Ford did in his debate with Carter, where you remember he said, in response to Max Frankel, Poland is free. And Frankel figured he just didn't hear the question right and went over it again and in effect told Ford, better give a different answer. And Ford, no, he jumped right in there and said it again. So those two things, I think, really opened up issues that helped us win.
And you know, the fascinating thing is, he knew.
Sure.
Of course, he's so stubborn. You know, he wouldn't give in.
That was probably it.
But the thing was, he had visited, because if you listen to the rest of the question, he talks about Poland, he talks about Romania, he talks about Yugoslavia. 3 countries that he visited and been very well received. And if he just put it in that context.
There'd been no trouble. But he somehow wanted us, the language he used, to believe that Poland was free, and it was not yet free. And that was, and 3 or 4 days later, he corrected it, but the damage had been done.
Years later, when we redid the museum, and the Polish gaff plays over and over. It's in the exhibit. And we're taking him through. I said, see, you weren't wrong. You were just ahead of your time. It took a while, though, before he could laugh about it.
It must have been painful.
Well, how would you characterize in your view, the main issues, the defining issues in the '76 campaign? And particularly the things that you were out there talking about.
I think the pardon had more to do with the outcome of that election than the pundits have said. And I say that because the few times I used the issue, the response from the audience almost scared me. A kind of anger. They wanted some kind of closure on that was different than the one they had. And there were suspicions about what went into it. I don't think there's anything to those suspicions. But I think that hung over the whole campaign. They always say that every new president is an antidote for the last president. I think Carter got a lot of mileage out of the feeling that he was honest and direct and would not do this sort of thing. And Ford and Dole were unable to really erase that concern. So there were many other things. The debate gaffes had a lot to do with it. You know, I think anybody who runs as a successor president, not one who's been elected, is sort of half a president. There's kind of a burden of proof that Ford had to carry because he wasn't quite, he was president, right? But when president, people hadn't put him there. They put him in as vice, they hadn't even put him in as vice president. So there was a little bit of that. I don't think Dole was really proved to be add much to the Ford formula. He might have added a lot to others, but the way Ford's strength and Dole's strength, I think they tended to complement each other.
It's interesting because, you know, the conversations I've had with both of them, Ford thought at the time that, you know, I mean, they were so far down in the polls that they didn't have the base.
Right.
They didn't have the agricultural Midwest.
Right.
And I mean, the Dakotas and Kansas and Nebraska.
Right.
And so whether it's a rationalization after the fact or a factor at the time, you know, and I think they also thought that it would be acceptable to the Reagan wing of the party.
And that's an important thing, don't you think, that Reagan challenged Ford and came very close to upending him, and Ford was thinking very carefully about how he could restore that strength. I think that's why he set aside Rockefeller and then picked Dole, because with Rockefeller he'd never get the Reagan people back. And so I think picking Dole, he may have calculated, would help him restore support there. Yeah, in fact, I think it's a source of some contention, because he was told very explicitly at that time, if you want to have a meeting with Governor Reagan after the nomination, okay, but under no circumstances are you to bring up the vice presidency. And of course, years later, Reagan said, "Oh, sure, I would have said yes." You sure.
Can't win.
Absolutely, no, you can't win. No.
We all know, I mean, Ford talked about staying in the Rose, or Dole talked about Ford staying at the Rose Garden, he went out in the Briar Patch. I mean, that's traditionally the role of the vice presidential candidate.
I want to say one thing, and I'm not sure how solid I am in this, but I have this recollection that Reagan never really went out and tried very hard to get Ford elected. So and if he had, I think it might have elected him.
Yeah. Well, in states like Mississippi.
We were that close. Yeah.
And southern Ohio.
Yep.
I mean, places that Reagan.
Yep.
In fact, I've often thought, and it's based on some factual basis, that one of the things that brought Presidents Ford and Carter together in later years
it was just that.
was Ronald Reagan. They both run against him, and I'm not sure they particularly relished the experience.
They were still thinking about it.
I think they were maybe still thinking about it. The vice presidential candidate does traditionally sort of carry the burden of being more partisan. We know about what Dole was doing in '76. What kinds of things were you? Where were you going? Where were they sending you?
Well, I had a map, and it was all where you'd expect. I started on the East Coast. I went across the Midwest, and then I would get to about Nebraska and jump over to the West Coast and make one or two trips through the South, and then I'd go back and forth. And last week I almost lived in Ohio. I was there more than the county commissioners there, and we carried it.
Yes, you did. Dole, true story. Lynn Nobziger told me the story first, and Dole confirmed it. Talk about a seat of the pants.
Oh, yeah.
One day, he was on the plane, looked at the map, he said, "Why don't we go there?"
Yes, like that. Oh, yeah. No, this is the last week is no longer strategic. Minute to minute.
There there is a quality, it's funny, there's a quality about Dole that I think would surprise people to hear it, because they think of him as sort of this driven, single-minded, ambitious person who wanted to be president more than anything else. But there's also this almost impish sense of the ridiculous about all of this.
He has a very healthy sense of the ridiculous. He also is a very serious, substantial person who cares about his country. The wonderful stuff he's done on veterans, World War II. He's been involved in so many things in his post-public life. His leadership days as majority leader of the U.S. Senate go down as great years in that Senate. And in his later years, he was almost the opposite of that first year. He was able to hold the whole Senate. He had the confidence of a lot of Democrats. He would stand up to his president or the president once in a while when he didn't agree with him. He was a man of the Senate. And I think this has all built him into this extraordinary American that almost everybody respects.
I can't tell you how many times he told me, in this place, you can't keep a grudge.
No.
And around this place, the only thing you have in the end is your word.
That's right.
And if it's no good, people will write you off.
That's right. And he was that person. And that's what makes the Senate click when it clicks.
You know, right after 70, he told me an amazing story. It may have been the day after 76, certainly within 2 or 3 days. And he got a call from Hubert Humphrey.
Yep.
Do you know about that? Or,
no, I don't know. That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, Hubert Humphrey called him, and I think he said, let's have lunch or something.
Yeah.
And he said, look, right now, you're going to get a lot of criticism.
Yeah.
But you know what you did, and you know where you were when you came out of that convention, and But I mean, just an amazing. Yeah. And he needless to say, he never forgot that.
Yeah.
But that's also
that's a sign of what we're talking about. Dole and Humphrey were very close. It was just a sign of how Dole was broadening and deepening as an American leader. It began to show in these ways.
Do you? Has he ever discussed the debates with you since?
No. But I see him once in a while. I see him less than I used to, but we always have a good time. We start talking about things, and we're good friends. We were good friends in that debate. I mean, that was one of the funny things. I knew he was having a bad night.
Were you having a good night?
Well, I've had worse nights.
With a little help from the...
that one night with Reagan wasn't much fun.
Oh, well, but on the first one you did. The first one.
I think he did.
Did you ever have a situation like that in your own party or in your own career where you felt you had to kind of sign on to something that you weren't...
I had an understanding with Carter. I said, look, when we talked first about running together, I said, I love the Senate. I don't have to do this. I think I can help you as much or more as a senator as I can as a vice president. But if you want this to go ahead, the one thing you have to let me do is keep my dignity. I cannot demean myself out there making arguments I don't believe in. And so if we get into a situation where you're for something that I can't support, just allow me to shut up. I know I can't in this position go out and attack the head of the ticket. The issue never came up, and some minor things had came up. But we'd actually talked about how we would handle that.
Was that influenced at all by the example of Hubert Humphrey?
Yes. And I think Humphrey, if you read Humphrey's autobiography, that chapter in there where he talks about how he got into this cheerleading on the war, which he actually didn't like at all, had written a letter to the president saying, we got to be worried about where we're going. He said that really hurt him and people looked at him differently, and he knew it.